Da 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 da. What's my good cheer? Welcome, welcome, everybody. Let's give YouTube a couple of minutes. Get those notifications out. Let people know I've gone live. In the meantime, if you've never met me before, hi, I'm Cindy. I explore the inside and the outside. And I was in the outside and the inside all day today. And it is in that understanding, it is an understanding that I am a light in the darkness. And, it is in that bumbling along, just like everybody else, that I have that opportunity by choice to make a little bit of movement for myself. And because I have my brand, I just love to come in sharing what I learn and what I experience, understanding now that it does truly, truly take all kinds to make the world, and to be able to bump into people who maybe not exactly like me, but kind of move a little bit like me and wake up to ideas at a pace that's comfortable, right? Where you can feel that it's digestible, a little bit believable, and to be able to trust in our own senses as to what's going on in our lives, right? How we could do a little bit better by ourselves, and more importantly, how we can do a little bit better by other people, because not everybody gets to understand, right? You're either a good person or you're a bad person. For somebody, hello Eugene, for somebody who like me, who's like well, who loves history. I really love history, and I used to put it in an analogy like this, right? You know, there are monkeys out in the world, and if they were to mate with a monkey from another species, so like an orangutan mated with a chimpanzee, and they had a baby, which does happen, right? Which does happen. Both of those species will reject that baby. And the only way that baby can survive is to find others like them, right? Heinz 57, we were talking about that yesterday, being two different parts, two different species. And it's becoming more relevant in this day and age because, again, we talked a little bit about it yesterday, how we're not paying attention to how we're having those intermittent, what do you call it, intimate relations with each other. Lots of times, you're going to the bar, or you're specifically going out to events to find somebody of the opposite sex or the same sex, right? But you're not looking at it in a intellectual, spiritual, even in a relatable way, in any way. You're just looking at it as something that's sexual, right? And you end up having babies, right? Somebody ends up being pregnant, and maybe that person who brings up that baby is separate, not partnered with the father of that baby or the mother of that baby, because in these days, men have rights too to their children. But that child only gets one perspective, and maybe they'll rub well if they have enough of those traits, right? Of that mother, that maybe they'll grow up to rub well, maybe they won't, right? So going back to these two different species of monkeys who have a baby, and the only way that that baby monkey can survive is to be able to find others like itself, because both parents, it's quite possible, both parents, and it's been proven scientifically, right? They've been studied that those those babies are most definitely rejected. And because it's not the norm to have a baby with a different species, more than likely that baby won't survive. But on the off chance, right? You know, uh, that it meets up with its same kind, being a hybrid of two species, that it can build its own tribe. You know what I mean? And this is how I look at myself quite often, because my parents were from the two extremes. My mother loved Jesus. She was a very religious person. Um, but my father had nothing to do with religion. My father was very spiritual. He was an entrepreneur, and he lived a totally different life. Because my father had such an amazing heart, because he was so sensitive to my feelings and the entire family's feelings, of course, in rubbing my mother the wrong way by being one, not a chimpanzee, but being in the middle, that my mother had rejected me, but my father, being the person that he was, right, maybe with the same understandings as I did, it takes all kinds to make the world, right? Maybe it was in the mindset that he had, because, he was a very kind person. You know, the only time I ever seen him angry was with my mother, right? And, other than swearing the S word every once in a while, he was so light. He was so, I don't know. I connected with him so well. And because I was codependent, because I wanted to be loved, I didn't understand that, I was sitting in the two extremes. I just thought my mother hated me. But because, she rejected me, because I was my father's daughter. And because I was my father's daughter, I became very codependent in that. But what if my father had rejected me too, right? That I had never been cared for or never been loved. How would I have grown up, right? How would have I grown up? Would I have been a homeless person? Would I have been a heroin addict or an alcoholic? Would I have been a really mean person, because that was the way that I was brought up, and that kind of aggression that was always going on in the household, right? I'm so grateful that that didn't happen for me, right? I was so grateful that, that I got to appreciate and understand love, not just the discipline, not just the rejection, not just the horrible things that were projected onto me, right? I'm grateful that I have better understandings now, that, you know, that it wasn't something that I had done, right? That it was just the way that things worked out, because my parents, right? They married within 2 weeks of meeting each other. If they had spent some time getting to know each other, right? They probably would not have gotten married. My father had bought an engagement ring for somebody else. He had a serious relationship with a nurse in a hospital, And he bought a ring and he proposed to this woman, and she rejected him, right? She said no. Um, my grandmother also worked in the hospital, and she was friends with my mother, and so she set my father up with my mother. And my father at the time was really seriously heartbroken and disillusioned with life, and didn't even have an opportunity to heal in that heartbreak before he was introduced to my mother. At that time in the 60s, you didn't, right, go off to the bar and have relations and stuff for the sake of just having relations. It just was not the norm. It wasn't something that was accepted in, right? You had to be married, and my dad was at that age, and he thought for sure that he had this nurse begged, right? Begged, right? That this woman that he loved so much, that this woman was going to be his wife. And when she refused him, he was just devastated. I'm so grateful actually that I got to sit down and have some of these stories told to me by my parents, so that I have a little bit better understanding of where they're coming from and where I'm coming from, right? My mother at that time was extremely traumatized when she was introduced to my father. I think she even had a crush on my father before, um, but right, he wasn't interested in her because he was looking to get engaged to somebody else. But when that situation happened with the woman he wanted to marry, right, she got my father, and because she was friends with my grandmother, who was my father's mother, yeah, they hooked up within 2 weeks. They were married. My father told me this story, how he gave that engagement ring that was meant for somebody else. He gave it to my mother. Um, my mother was totally traumatized because she was assaulted shortly before she got married, and she was afraid to be by herself. And it was perfect timing for her getting together with my father, and it was really, really quick. My father did not want to see that ring. It was a reminder of his true love. And so he pawned the ring. He told my mother that they needed money. He pawned the ring, and he never went back to claim the ring. He never explained to my mother why he did that, or why he didn't retrieve the ring for her. And she held it against him his entire life. I remember her all the time. Every time they got into an argument or something, or she wanted to get the kids on her side, she would tell this story about what happened to her engagement ring. I perfectly sympathize with my father, who would want to be reminded, right, of a heartbreak for the rest of his life. Every time he saw my mother's hand with that ring on it, it would have been a reminder to him. He could have explained it to her, but he never did. My dad kept a lot of stories to himself. I'm privileged that, in having that relationship, being the oldest child in the family, that he did have those conversations for me with me. And I don't know if it was for my own understanding. I didn't really understand as a child, but doing shadow work, right, in the past 10 years, it's what I do. I go back to those childhood experiences, childhood conversations, and I have to look at those experiences and conversations and relationships as an adult. And I can feel for my mother now. I never cared for my mother when she rejected me. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a projection, it was a dejection, and it was pretty brutal. And especially when my father went away for such great lengths of times. He was a commercial fisherman. He'd go off for every fishing season, every fish, like salmon fishing or cod fishing or halibut fishing. He would have these seasons and he would take off for a couple of months, 3 months at a time. And I would be just victim to whatever, right, was going on, already understanding that I was being rejected, but not really understanding at that time as to why, right? I have better understandings of that now, looking back as an adult, not going back in that child experience, but actually with the information that I have and the conversations with my father and the conversations with my mother and those fights and those life experiences I've had, that I have better understandings, right? And I am softer towards my mother's experience of me. It doesn't make it any less painful for me. I was still rejected in that, right? I was still victimized in that. And I don't revel in that. I only say it because there are lessons in understanding that, we live in a world now that there are so many light in the darknesses, and not just light in the darknesses, but there are dark in the lightnesses too. Darks that are touching the light for the very first time in their life. And it can be very, very confusing to have different aspects and different traits of ourselves and think we're a good person and all of a sudden we're blowing up. It helps me to better understand something that I grew up in, right? In this idea of turn the other cheek. I always had such a hard time turning the other cheek. I always wanted people to understand what they were doing to me, right? Not understanding. They knew perfectly well what they were doing to me, right? Or doing to somebody else. And my whole family was a victim in that, unless, right, they swayed a little bit closer to my mother's being, right? And as much as I was my father's daughter, my sister Tracy was my mother's daughter. And surprisingly, me and my sister Tracy, we always got along up until, well, I can't really say just up until recently because there have been experiences, stealing boyfriends and, right, and not spending a lot of time together until we were actually adults and living on our own. And there were experiences in that. But as much as I appreciate my mother's experience, that my heart is softened a little bit in that experience, that you know, to understand that, that rejection wasn't anything that she really had a choice in. Right, as much as I wasn't going to turn the other cheek, she wasn't going to turn the other cheek in her own experience, right? It was very painful relationship between me and my mother, and it was a very codependent relationship between me and my father. And I'm so grateful again. I You guys hear me say this word grateful all the time, but I am so grateful for the understandings that come across my path. Even that story, like how how that bit of information about the two different species of monkeys. If I hadn't known that story, I would have no idea and no reference to um, understand, right? Because I'm only using the experience of the two species of monkeys, and how if they had a baby monkey, right? Two different species, that both those species would have ignored it, right? Little bit more common these days, that we are hooking up and we are having children with people who are totally opposite of us. And again, if the father isn't in the household, or the mother is not rubbing with that child well, that of course that child is going to be, could grow up to be resentful, could be growing up to be very empathic because they're very in tune to those emotions and those senses of rejection that are going on, right? It was only through love that I actually survived that experience, and that's the truth. It was only love, and I've been able and grateful that love has come across my path a few times, but that's only because, right, in being that child of two different species. We're just going to relate that because they were from the two extremes. So I'm just going to relate to them as two different species. That even in that rejection, uh, I found others like me, right? Those light in the darknesses, and also the darknesses in the light, because they're still hybrids, they're still 50/50s. And even though, I'll have good traits and dark traits, those good traits and dark traits can be different by somebody who is the same as me, because they picked up different aspects of each of their parents, whichever was more comfortable, whatever was more available at the time, right? And I could have grown up to be very resentful. I was hurt, but I had come to an acceptance of my life because, again, being that child of two different species, it wasn't just my parents that I had to worry about. It was the outside world, because the outside world was also one or the other, right? These days, it's a little bit easier to feel that, right, there are more people out there that are a combination of both. It's becoming uh, very common, only because, right, we are not required to stay with one mate for our entire lives. We are meant to be with one mate our entire lives, but it's not happening, right? It's not happening because, well, if you don't have to marry it and you're getting it, why get married, right? If it's just a good time in a moment, and that first fight or that first time that somebody ticks you off and you are not legally bound to them, you could just say, ha, see you on the beach, and off they go. And then there's only one perspective that that child is being brought up in. And if they are a light in their darkness and they're being brought up by the dark, right? Resentment, jealousy, confusion, right? Misunderstandings, no opportunity to understand in any way, and then they grow up to be, right, those same kind of adults, right? This is evolution, you guys. It's plain and simple to me. Like I could clearly see it because we've given up on some of these traditions, and they are traditions, I believe now. I didn't understand casting, that in India casting is very important to their culture, but it kind of makes sense now that I'm right understanding about evolution a little bit, that casting keeps you in the light or it keeps you out of the light, right? It keeps you with your same kind. Whether that's a good thing, I don't think so, because I think we've gone so far beyond and so deep, um, with the idea that you can just, right, have a different father with every child that you have. And can you imagine the hairy, scary of those relationships within the family, within those kids, the hierarchy, even, right? And if none of them wake up to any of those ideas and never have the opportunity to come across somebody like themselves, possibly because of the casting, right? That 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 child doesn't have a chance to wake up to any of the ideas that I wake up to or have woken up to, right? And I'm sure others have too, right? Lots of people are just bumbling along and not really having any understanding about what's going on, that we're actually, right, catapulted by our own choices into evolution, into change that we can't put back in that jar, that we can't put that lid on it and bury it, because it's so widespread now, right? And that's the truth. When I was a kid, I didn't know anybody who was divorced. I didn't know anybody who didn't have two parents unless one of them had passed away. And I did actually have one friend, and my friend Beverly Edwards. I've talked about her a few times. She was a big black Amazon lady who got to be friends with me by beating up a bunch of girls who were beating on me. And it was kind of like she was my bodyguard, and we became friends. And even when I moved, I would go and visit her every once in a while. I wish her well. I hope her life has turned out amazing. But I remember her mom didn't have a husband. I don't know if they were divorced or if he passed away, but she was very kind, and her kids grew up loved, even though my friend Beverly Edwards had a few kids already by the time she was 16 or 17 years old. She started, like I said, she was a big Amazon lady. Like she looked 20 when she was like 12 years old. And yeah, I think of her once in a while and I wish her well. And she was such a good friend to me. But we connected a little bit, maybe because she was in her own light in the darkness. I'm only going to say light in the darkness because her mother was lovely too, right? And very accepting of me. uh I relate to dark in their lightness when somebody rubs me not well. Even my mother was a dark in her lightness, right? That no, she was a light in her darkness, but she let the darkness run her world. And I don't know if she ever felt bad. She never apologized. She never in her entire life. And we sat down when my husband went to the military and I went to live with my mom. for 6 months, that I took that opportunity to kind of sort through some of these childhood hurts, childhood experiences. And even then, I didn't get a lot of answers as to why it happened or how she felt. But I believe it's because she didn't even know herself, right? And even then, she didn't apologize, for what happened. She barely even tried to explain. It was just kind of, that's what it is. Sometimes it happens, right? I didn't know I was going to tell that story tonight. It was only because in my lessons today, uh, I was reminded in a couple of those lessons of, you hear about uh, you know different cultures not getting along, different religious ideas and different spiritual ideas not getting along. And I just wanted to put it out there as an explanation that neither is good or bad, right? They're just both, right? It's just both. And as we move forward, right, we're in a stage of evolution now that I, I am having that opportunity now, especially living in this, I guess, casting, right? I guess it's casting. I am considered low income. Uh, so I get to meet more of people that are similar to me. And you know what? They are so kind and they're so accepting of me. And not only that, they pay me that respect and I'm able to do the same for them. And it makes me think about, job interviews and managers and bosses and different companies I work for and how come I had a lot of hard times in fitting into some jobs and how I sometimes really, right, got along with who I worked with and really enjoyed some of those jobs, right? Like when I was a waitress and a bartender, right? Takes all kinds to make the world. You're not going to find anybody more both than people who hang out in bars because they're just looking for good times. They're looking to overcome uh, their miserableness in their lives, right? And, when I say that I want to help people untangle their wires, I truly do want to help people untangle those wires because I did it for myself. And when I did it for myself, I did it for also for people that I never thought that I would even consider doing that for, right? After the experiences I had, right? Like I could have easily been resentful. I could have easily been jealous of the relationships that, my mother had with my sister, because she was my mother's daughter. Why does she love her but she doesn't love me? And I was so good. I was like doing cartwheels and flips and acrobatics and whatever it took, right? To get a little bit of acceptance out of her. By the time I was a teenager, I knew there was no hope in that. She wasn't interested. She was just waiting for me to turn 18 so she could turn me out of the house. And I knew that only because it was one of her favorite sayings. I heard it every single day since the day I was 12 years old until I was 18. And it's funny though, I didn't leave her house, and I think I was 19 years old when I finally left the house for good. But at the same time, I had that opportunity to come to this amazing province Manitoba, where there were so many people like me that I was able to find a place to fit in for the first time in my entire life. The people in Manitoba were so amazing, but I didn't understand, right? That they had already started that process in their evolution of being in the two extremes. Maybe not understanding, but at the very least accepting where they were in life. And just in that, I was able to find a place to fit in. And I think it's another contributing factor as to why I woke up to some of these ideas. It was decades later, but it was the start, right? It was in those small introductions to really taking a look as to what happened and why it happened, and looking at those experiences as an adult and not just as a child. Okay, that was a kind of a heavy one, but that's an important one to consider at the very least. Just to consider that, because lots of people, they love Jesus and they're going to say, "Oh my goodness, I don't have a bad bone in my body." Maybe that's what you project out to the world, right? Maybe that's what you would like to be. But like me, you stumble over yourself, you do cartwheels and flips, and right? And you brainwash yourself into really believing that way. And sometimes that's a good thing too, right? But I think eventually we're all supposed to wake up to some of these ideas. We can't all just be moving along like the generations before us, because, right, that is not evolution. And Homo sapiens, out of 15 different species, at least 15 different species of humans, they were the only ones who survived, right? Something to consider. And if you don't quite understand the concept or the analogy I was using with the two different uh, ape species having babies and being rejected by both species, do a little bit of googling. Right, do a little bit of googling. It's not secret information or anything. It's just scientific tidbits that came across my path, but it just kind of went blah right in my brain, like it just blew up in there, and I was just, oh my goodness. And it helped to untangle some of those wires that I had. It helped me to be a little bit more sympathetic towards somebody who was very different than me. And it helped me to settle into my system, because at that time I thought I was um, very open to different people. I thought I was very open minded to this idea that it takes all kinds to make the world. But if I truly looked hard enough, I would have seen that really wasn't the case. That I'm going to just call it prejudiced in my ideas, right? Because not because they were a different race, but because they were a different species, because they didn't rub well with me and I didn't rub well with them, but because I didn't understand, I didn't have any reference point or understanding that, right, that could have been my lifelong experience. And if I had had children, right, I would have passed those understandings to my children. And that's probably a truth. So it's in our little bit of movement that we do for ourselves. And lots of people, they don't want to do that shadow work. They don't want to go back into the past. That's the past. Leave it back there. But how can we understand the issues that we have in the moment, right? Those mental issues and those emotional issues that are like wrenches in our life, that ruin our relationships, that ruin our kids, and our kids end up being little brats when they grow up, or you're just absolutely amazed because you're a tattooed biker who's been in jail half their life, and you got children who are just straight laced and nerdy and just like, how could those be my kids? They're just like so perfect, right? And it's because those kids got to have a choice. You gave them a choice, which is absolutely amazing, to take on the good points of one parent and the good points of another. And it's not like, if you got a little bit of dark in you, if that biker with the tattoos who's been in jail half his life, right? That doesn't mean that that person doesn't have a heart, that that person didn't have a parent that loved them and tried to set him on the right path, right? Or had a little bit of understanding, or that story about the two species of monkeys, right? So that they might have a better understanding of what's going on, right? We're conscious man now. We are the next stage of evolution. We should be able to better understand what's going on with us, right? And that's only an analogy. So, depending on your political ideas, your cultural, traditional, religious ideas, you're going to look at it differently, right? You're going to look at it through the lens of whatever you're going to look through, right? Whether it is the religious perspective, or a spiritual perspective, or it's a cultural perspective, or a political perspective, right? That you'll look at it through that lens, but it'll still be the same thing. You'll just explain it a little bit different than me. And that's okay, right? The only idea is that it's explained. That's the only thing, really, in the end, that matters, right? And if somebody gets it, fantastic. And if nobody gets it, maybe it's just not time yet. Maybe there isn't enough of those hybrids, right? Those new children in the next stage of evolution. And we're going to understand, right, that we are going to be the ones that move forward, just like the Homo sapiens. They moved forward, and all the other humans, right, became extinct. It is evolution. It's just not human evolution. It's right. Every animal, every insect, every reptile, every bird, right? And there have been new species discoveries as of recently, too. And that is pretty incredible and adds on to the evidence as to what's going on in the world, right? I'm a realist, you guys, and right, I find it hard sometimes to even explain some of these things myself because I am such a realist. But at the same time, I have to accept that I don't have the answers for everything, that I'm bumbling along just like everybody else. But in my perceptions, right, they lead to perspectives that I can hold on to as lifelines, that I can hold on to as tools and resources that will help me to better move along in a more balanced and understanding way. Understanding, right? I am light in the darkness, right? And those are people that I would just absolutely love to to help, right? Because, well, I'd like to find more people like me. That's for sure, right? That's for sure. Okay, you guys, I was going to pull a card tonight, but I think I'm going to leave it at that. It has been a long It has been a long day. I did some serious walking up back alleys and stuff. Um, uh, Collecting rhubarb without going into people's yards. I'm just picking it up outside fences and stuff. There were lots of apple trees hanging over the fences. I just wanted to put my hand up and grab apples, but instead I was looking at the ground and I managed to get 3 or 4 apples today that weren't bruised and already being eaten by insects. And maybe I'll go out tomorrow for another walk and see if we can score a little bit more rhubarb and a few more apples. Who's to say? But yeah, it has been a very interesting day inside and out. Thank you, Eugene, as usual, for popping into my live. I much appreciate it. For those of you who pop in later, put your feet up. I hope you at least find it entertaining, food for thought at the very least. And if somebody gets something out of that, if not, right, that's okay too. It is a process, and I'm still moving forward no matter what. You guys have a great evening, have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.